A couple weeks ago, we got a new Superman movie, so now it's time to rank all 12 Superman movies from the worst to the best. Last place, Superman Returns. This is easily my least favorite Superman movie because it completely misunderstands who Superman is supposed to be. As goofy as some of the older sequels became, they at least understood the core of the character. Christopher Reeve's Superman was kind, selfless, optimistic, and genuinely wanted to help people. Even when the movies got ridiculous, they never lost sight of who Superman was. This movie throws that out the window. Instead, we're told Superman disappeared for 5 years without telling anybody, apparently had an affair with Lois Lane beforehand, got her pregnant, and then just left. When he finally comes back, rather than taking responsibility, he is a deadbeat dad who spends most of the movie silently stalking Lois from a distance and acting jealous that she moved on with another man. That is not Superman. The whole point of the character is that he's the ultimate Boy Scout. He's the ideal person, the kind of hero humanity wishes it could be. He's supposed to represent hope, responsibility, and integrity. Making him into a deadbeat dad completely betrays that concept. And the timeline makes it even weirder because the actress who plays Lois was only 23 when the movie came out, and her son is around 5 years old. That means Lois would have been barely 18 when Superman got her pregnant. Whether that was intentional or not, it makes the relationship feel really uncomfortable. Even putting all that aside, the movie is just very boring. Nothing happens. Superman barely fights anyone. There's basically no action, excitement, and Lex Luthor's real estate scheme somehow feels even stupider than it did back in the 70s. The one somewhat engaging sequence is Superman saving the airplane about 20 minutes in, and unfortunately, that scene is where the movie peaks. Once that scene ends, the movie immediately goes back to moving at a snail's pace. It feels less like a superhero movie and more like a very expensive soap opera. It has one mildly interesting action scene, but it's surrounded by over 2 hours of melodrama and very questionable storytelling. Number 12, Superman 4, The Quest for Peace. The 1980s had a very strange habit of producing very special episodes where sitcoms would suddenly stop being funny for 30 minutes so the characters could lecture the audience about drugs, bullying, nuclear weapons, or whatever the topic was of the month. This movie feels like one of those episodes, but stretched into a feature length film. Honestly, I don't even mind the basic premise. Superman trying to eliminate nuclear weapons is exactly the kind of idealistic story that fits Silver Age Superman comics. Those old comics and the Max Fleischer cartoons could be incredibly preachy as well. The problem is not the message, the problem is how it's executed. The dialogue is painfully awkward, the acting feels phoned in, the special effects are horrible. Whenever people defend the visuals by saying, well, it came out in the 80s, I don't support that argument. Movies like Back to the Future, Aliens, Terminator, and Roger Rabbit all came out around the same era and still hold up remarkably well. This movie simply didn't have the budget or effort. You constantly see obvious green screens, awkward flying shots that are used over and over, and effects that look unfinished. Even Nuclear Man, despite having a fun comic book concept, comes across as unintentionally hilarious because of how poorly executed everything is. The previous Superman films, as flawed as they were, still felt like people were trying to make good movies. This one feels like everyone had already given up before the filming had even started. Number 11, Supergirl from 2026. I was honestly really looking forward to this movie. The trailers made it look like it was going to be a fun cosmic adventure with a different style from Superman. I was excited to see what direction they would take Kara, and I was especially optimistic because the director previously made Cruella, which I actually think is one of the better Disney live-action remakes. The reason Cruella worked for me is because it wasn't just copying the animated movie beat for beat. It had its own identity, visual style, and it wasn't afraid to take risks. Whether you loved it or not, at least it felt like somebody had an idea. So it's really disappointing to see that same director make a comic book movie that feels so safe, so derivative, and so paint by numbers. The biggest issue is mainly the story itself. The stakes simply are not big enough. The entire movie revolves around Supergirl trying to get a cure after Crypto is poisoned. Now that sounds like that could be an emotionally compelling idea, but the problem is we all know exactly how it's going to end. They're not going to kill the dog. First of all, audiences almost universally hate when movies kill dogs. You can wipe out entire cities in an action movie, and people shrug it off, but you hurt the dog, and suddenly everybody's upset. Second, Crypto is a massive merchandising opportunity, and DC knows that. They're not getting rid of him after just one movie. That would be like killing Grogu in the Mandalorian movie. It's not going to happen. So because we already know the outcome, there's basically no suspense. Instead, the movie just keeps inventing reasons why Supergirl can't get the cure. Every time she's about to succeed, something random happens that forces the story to continue. It almost becomes the opposite of a Deus Ex Machina. Instead of a miracle solving the problem, the movie keeps creating new problems out of nowhere. After about the third or fourth time this happens, it starts feeling less like natural storytelling and more like the writer stretching a very thin plot into a feature-length movie. Then we get to what I think is the movie's biggest problem. I really didn't like this version of Supergirl. Now, before anyone misunderstands what I'm saying, I'm completely on board with having strong female characters. The important word there is strong and well written. Some of the best female characters are optimistic, passionate, and inspiring. When I think of Supergirl, I think the definitive version is the one from the CW series. That version of Kara is kind, hopeful, and the type of hero you actually want people to look up to. But this version constantly drinks, parties, swears, and acts like she doesn't care about anything. Combined with the costume design and the overall attitude, she feels less like Supergirl and more like Star-Lord. And that's kind of the problem with the whole movie. It's ironic that the one DC movie that has not been directed by James Gunn is the one that feels most like Guardians of the Galaxy. And the reason Guardians of the Galaxy worked is because the characters it cast worked. They're all wildly different personalities bouncing off each other. That's what made the movies entertaining. Here, it feels like they're copying the style without understanding why the style worked in the first place. You can't just throw in sarcastic quips, licensed music, colorful aliens, and quirky humor and expect the audience to care. It ends up feeling less like a movie that's trying to entertain another movie instead of establishing its own identity. Ironically, the best characters aren't even the main character. The supporting characters end up being far more memorable. Even the villain has more personality than Kara herself. Whenever the side characters become more interesting than the hero you're supposed to be following, it's a pretty significant storytelling problem. The superhero movie lives and dies by whether you enjoy spending time with the hero or heroine, and unfortunately, I just didn't. Now, I don't think this means the new DC universe is doomed, far from it. The MCU had an incredible launch with Iron Man, but after that they followed it up with the Incredible Hulk, Iron Man 2, and Thor, which were forgettable, a noticeable step down, and decent, but hardly amazing. Even Marvel had to spend a few years figuring out what worked before hitting its stride. So I'm not going to write off the new DCU after just one disappointing movie. I still think there's plenty of potential, but this definitely isn't the direction I personally wanted Supergirl to go. Something else worth mentioning is the tone. It absolutely earned the PG-13 rating. It's darker than I was expecting, both in its themes and overall atmosphere. There's a lot of drinking, fair amount of swearing, and an overall sense of cynicism throughout the whole movie. That tone might work for certain DC characters such as Batman, but it doesn't really work for Supergirl. One of the things that has traditionally separated Superman and Supergirl from characters like Batman is that they're symbols of hope. And speaking of which, there is an incredibly stupid line from Superman. We wear bright colors so everybody knows we're good. Okay, explain why Batman wears dark colors then, and explain why villains like Joker, Harley, and Riddler all wear bright colors. It's such a dumb, laughable line. This movie seems much more interested in making Kara edgy than they are inspirational, and that's just not the version of a character I wanted to see. At the end of the day, I walked away feeling like this movie lacked confidence. Instead of trying to carve out its own identity, it borrows pieces from other successful franchises. It copies the tone of Guardians, and most of the 30 to 60-second needle drops feel forced, and one was outright utterly laughable, because it just did not fit what was going on in the scene at all. It follows familiar superhero story beats, the plot is surprisingly thin, the characters don't have much depth, and the emotional moments never really landed because I never became invested in the journey. That's what makes this movie such a disappointment. Not because it's the worst superhero movie ever made, like a lot of people are saying. It's not. There's far worse superhero movies out there. Madam Web comes to mind. It's because there was so much potential here. The trailers promised something exciting. The director had already proven he could make a stylish fresh blockbuster such as Cruella, and instead we got something that feels assembled from spare parts of other, much better movies. Number 10, the Supergirl movie from 1984, which, let's be fair, is not a good movie either, and I actually think this hate gets a little more hate than it deserves. It's not a good movie, and it is incredibly cheesy, but it's no cheesier than most of the Christopher Reeve Superman films that were coming out around the time. But instead of feeling like a superhero movie, it plays more like a low-budget fantasy adventure from the 80s. It almost feels like someone mixed Superman characters with a Saturday afternoon sword and sorcery movie, and the performances are wildly over the top. Now, Faye Dunaway completely embraces the camp, chewing every piece of scenery she possibly can, and Helen Slater is charming enough as Kara, even though the script doesn't give her much to work with, and her performance is what puts it above Supergirl 2026, because this one I actually somewhat enjoy watching. The effects obviously haven't aged that well, and the story is pretty forgettable, but there's not sincerity to the whole thing. Unlike Supergirl 2026, it's not cynical. Everyone seems fully committed to the ridiculousness, and because of that, I have a good enough time with it. Now, it's not a good movie, but I'd rather watch an earnest, goofy mess than something that feels creatively lifeless. And honestly, it's still better than the later seasons of the CW series. Number 9, Superman 3. This is where the series really started to lose its identity. The first two Reeves movies at least attempted to balance superhero adventure with heartfelt drama. This one feels like it can't decide whether it wants to be a Superman movie or a goofy comedy with Richard Pryor. And that's unfortunate because buried underneath all the silliness is a pretty interesting idea. The concept of Superman becoming corrupted and literally fighting his better self is a pretty cool idea. The junkyard battle between the evil Superman and ordinary Clark Kent remains one of the movie's most memorable moments because it's one of the few times Superman's greatest enemy is himself. Unfortunately, everything else is a mess. The villain's motivations are incredibly weak, comedy constantly interrupts the pacing, special effects somehow look worse than the previous films despite coming a few years later, and instead of building on what made Superman 2 successful, it feels like the filmmakers simply chased bigger laughs and cheaper gags. There are moments that work, but they bury me so much nonsense they're difficult to appreciate. Number 6, Superman from 1978. I completely understand why this movie is considered one of the most important superhero films ever made. Without it, we probably don't get movies like Batman, Spider-Man, or the MCU. Christopher Reeve delivers what is still one of the greatest superhero performances ever put on screen. He completely convinces you that Clark Kent and Superman are two entirely different people without relying on makeup or special effects. John Williams' score is iconic. Even today, hearing the main theme instantly makes you think of Superman. And the flying effects also deserve a lot of credit. Considering it came out back in '78, they still look surprisingly convincing in most of the scenes. That being said, watching the movie today can be a bit of a slog, because the pacing is incredibly slow. It takes nearly 45 minutes before Superman actually starts doing anything important. Compared to modern superhero films, where the story usually gets moving within the first 15 or 20 minutes, this feels almost leisurely. Lex Luthor's real estate scheme is also hilariously small scale by today's standards. His grand evil plan is essentially create expensive beachfront property. Like, that's literally a plot of a Phineas and Ferb episode. It's certainly unique, it's also kind of ridiculous, and then there's the ending. Superman flying around the Earth backwards to reverse time has become iconic, but it's also one of the biggest deus ex machinas in comic book movie history. You'll believe a man can fly, sure, but you'll believe he can reverse time by spinning the planet backwards? That's a bit much. The movie also contains a few moments that definitely show its age, including a scene where attempted sexual assault is treated like a joke. Despite all of that, the movie deserves enormous respect. It established the blueprint that nearly every superhero movie has followed ever since. Even if later films improved upon many of its ideas, somebody had to be first. Number 7, Justice League 2017. Now, I actually enjoyed this movie when it came out, and then I watched the Snyder Cut. Now it's almost impossible to go back. The theatrical cut feels less like a finished movie and more like a TV edit, because that's what it basically is. Warner Brothers infamously mandated a runtime of under 2 hours, forcing huge portions of the story to be removed, the biggest casualty being Cyborg. Instead of being the emotional heart of the movie, he's reduced to just this random guy on the team. Steppenwolf becomes an incredibly generic villain, because almost all of his motivations and backstory were removed. The humor is awkwardly inserted, often undercutting scenes that originally had emotional weight. Visually, the movie is also very inconsistent. Some scenes clearly belong to Snyder, while others feel completely different because of the reshoots. It's not a terrible movie, it's just messy. Knowing what the finished version looks like makes this one feel like watching an unfinished rough cut. Number 6, the theatrical cut of Superman 2, which is definitely an improvement over Superman 78. The pacing is much stronger. The movie gives Superman into the action faster, and General Zod immediately raises the stakes by giving Superman physical opponents who can actually challenge him. I also like Lois gradually finding out Clark's identity. That relationship feels more developed than it did in the first movie, even if the ending eventually undoes much of that development. Reeves continues to be fantastic, and Terrence Stamp makes for an entertaining Zod. You can definitely see why this movie inspired so many later Superman stories, specifically Man of Steel in 2013. That said, after watching the Richard Donner cut, it's difficult not to notice the compromises. Certain scenes feel rushed, character motivations don't always line up the best, and the ending is incredibly abrupt. It's still a solid sequel, it's just hard not to compare it to the superior version. Number 5, Dawn of Justice. I know this is probably the hottest take on the list, but I genuinely enjoyed this movie. Is it messy? Yes. Does it juggle way too much? Of course. You can clearly tell this started as a direct sequel to Man of Steel, before Warner Brothers decided to turn it into the launching point for an entire cinematic universe. The script sometimes feels like it's juggling 3 or 4 different movies at once. That being said, I find the action scenes very fun, Batman is brutal and intimidating, Wonder Woman's entrance remains one of the cool superhero introductions ever put on screen, Hans Zimmer's score is phenomenal, Jesse Eisenberg was completely miscast as Lex Luthor, but I still appreciate how ambitious the movie was. It reaches something bigger than the average superhero film, even if it doesn't always reach it. I'd rather watch an ambitious, flawed movie than a completely safe one. Number 4, the Richard Donner cut of Superman 2. Watching the Richard Donner cut right after the theatrical version almost feels like watching 2 completely different movies. The overall story is largely the same, but the tone, pacing, character development, and emotional weight are dramatically different. It's honestly hard to believe they came from the same production. The biggest improvement is Superman himself. In the theatrical cut, he often feels like he's simply reaching to whatever happens next. Here, Clark is much more emotionally conflicted. You really feel the weight of his decision to give up his powers in order to have a normal life with Lois. The movie spends much more time exploring the sacrifice, making his eventual return to Superman feel earned instead of inevitable. Lois is also a much stronger character in this version. Her relationship with Clark is given room to breathe, and the chemistry between the two feels much more believable. Instead of rushing from one plot point to the next, Donner lets the romance develop naturally, making the emotional moments land far better. The pacing is another huge improvement. Scenes flow together more smoothly, character motivations make more sense, and the movie feels much more focused. Even though there are still a few moments that show the film's age, the overall storytelling is significantly stronger than the theatrical version. I also appreciate how much more consistent the tone feels with the first Superman movie. Since Donner directed most of both films before being replaced, this version actually feels like a true continuation of the first movie. The theatrical cut sometimes jumps awkwardly between serious drama and goofy comedy, while this version maintains a much steadier emotional balance. The ending is probably the most divisive change, and I can understand why some people still prefer the theatrical version. Even so, I think the emotional journey leading up to it is so much stronger than more than makes up for it. More than anything, this movie makes me wonder why Warner Brothers didn't simply release this version in the first place. It's more coherent, the characters are better written, the emotional stakes are higher, and it fits much more naturally alongside the original film. It's one of the best examples in history of how different editing and directing decisions can completely transform the exact same footage into something much, much better. Number 3, Man of Steel. This is easily the most divisive interpretation of the Superman character, but I admire how willing the movie is to do something different. Rather than portraying Superman as an already perfected symbol of hope, the movie asks how someone with those powers would realistically grow into becoming that symbol. It's a much more grounded, conflicted version of Clark Kent. The action is spectacular, the Krypton opening is visually incredible, Hans Zimmer's score is absolutely phenomenal, Henry Cavill looks and feels like Superman. That said, the movie isn't without its problems. It's way too serious. For a movie about hope, it spends a lot of time being bleak. The religious symbolism is also incredibly heavy-handed, and while I personally don't mind the ending as much as some people do, I completely understand why it remains controversial. It's also probably 45 minutes longer than it needed to be. Even so, I'd rather watch a bold reinterpretation than something that simply repeats what we've already seen. This version of Superman isn't for everyone, but I respect how much it commits to its vision. Number 2, Superman 2025. Much like the MCU Spider-Man movies, this film understands that we've already seen Superman's origin story countless times. We know Krypton explodes, we know the Kents raise Clark, we know he becomes Superman. So instead of spending the first 30 or 40 minutes retelling that story, the movie wisely drops us into a world where Superman has already been operating as a hero for the past 3 years. That decision immediately gives the movie a sense of momentum. This version of the DC Universe feels lived in from the very beginning. Metahumans already exist, giant monsters and alien invasions don't seem completely out of the ordinary, for them it's just Tuesday, and the citizens of Metropolis react like they've seen this sort of chaos before. It feels like opening a random issue of a long-running Superman comic, rather than watching Chapter 1 of the Cinematic Universe. The action is also fantastic. Instead of trying to ground everything in realism like Man of Steel, this movie fully embraces the colorful, over-the-top nature of comic books. Superman punches giant kaiju, flies through impossible environments, and performs feats that would have looked ridiculous in a darker interpretation. But here, they fit. It almost feels like watching a live-action Saturday morning cartoon, and I mean that in the best possible way. That said, I do think the movie occasionally pushes the silliness a little too far. There are a handful of jokes and comedic moments that undercut scenes, which probably would have been stronger if they'd simply let the emotion breathe. James Gunn's sense of humor works most of the time, but every once in a while it feels like he can't resist adding just one or two more jokes. Another issue I had was the narrative structure. The story feels episodic. It reminded me a lot of the Snyder Cut, which was divided into 6 chapters. Here, the movie constantly fades to black before jumping to another storyline or another group of characters. Instead of feeling like one continuous narrative building towards something big, it sometimes feels like several episodes of a series edited together into a single film. It's not enough to ruin the movie, but it does make the pacing a little uneven. The visual effects are another area where I notice some inconsistency. Most of the CGI is pretty good, but there are a few flying shots where Superman looks noticeably CGI. They're brief moments, but they stood out enough that I noticed them. Where the movie really shines is its characters. This is easily the best version of Lex Luthor. Previous versions often leaned heavily into camp, and the original film literally had him trying to make money through a real estate scam. This version feels like an actual threat. He's manipulative, intelligent, ruthless, and absolutely obsessed with bringing Superman down. Nicholas Hoult plays him with just the right amount of arrogance and hatred. He's occasionally a little over the top, but in a way that fits the comic book tone, and he's the kind of villain you genuinely love to hate. David Corenswet also does a terrific job as Superman. He captures the kindness, optimism, and quiet confidence that define the character, while still making him feel like a real person. His chemistry with Lois Lane is excellent, and the two immediately feel believable together. And then there's Krypto. As much as I enjoyed Superman himself, Krypto completely steals the movie. Every time he appears, he manages to be funny, chaotic, adorable, and surprisingly heroic all at once. He could have easily felt like a gimmick added to sell toys, but instead he ends up becoming one of the film's biggest highlights. More than anything else, what impressed me was how well this movie balances honoring Superman's history while also updating him for modern audiences. It isn't embarrassed by the brighter, more hopeful side of the character, and embraces the weirdness of the comics while still telling a story that feels emotionally sincere. The reason it doesn't quite reach the number one spot is because of the storytelling. The episodic structure keeps it flowing as smoothly as I'd like, and there are a few moments where the humor, pacing, or CGI don't quite land. But those are relatively small complaints. At the end of the day, this is exactly what a Superman movie should be: hopeful, exciting, colorful, heartfelt, and genuinely fun. It proves that Superman doesn't need to be reinvented to feel relevant. He just needs a right filmmaker who understands why people loved him for nearly 90 years. It's not perfect, but it's an absolute triumph and one of the best Superman movies ever made. And in first place is the Snyder Cut. This is, without question, the definitive version of Justice League. After watching the theatrical cut, it's honestly hard to believe these movies were assembled from much of the same footage. The difference in quality is night and day. The biggest improvement is the characters. In the theatrical version, several members of the Justice League barely get any development at all, especially Cyborg, who mostly just exists because the plot needs someone who can hack computers. Here, he's arguably the emotional heart of the entire movie. We actually get to understand his relationship with his father, his struggles after the accident that transformed him, and what he sacrificed him to join the team. Ray Fisher finally gets the chance to get the performance that was almost completely cut out of the theatrical version. The villain also benefits tremendously. Steppenwolf goes from being one of the most forgettable comic book villains ever put on screen to someone whose motivations actually make sense. He's no longer just a generic alien invading Earth because he's evil. He's desperately trying to earn his way back into Darkseid's good graces after failing him in the past. It doesn't necessarily make him sympathetic, but it does make him feel like an actual character instead of a video game boss. The world building is also another huge strength. The movie takes its time to introduce concepts like the Mother Boxes, the history of Darkseid, the ancient battle for Earth, the new gods, and the anti-life equation. If you're a long-time DC fan, there's so much lore packed in this movie, it's incredibly rewarding. Rather than rushing from action scene to action scene, Snyder lets the audience absorb the mythology and understand why the events matter. The score is also a massive improvement. The music feels much more epic and emotionally appropriate, helping give each hero their own identity. Combined with a more serious tone, the movie finally feels like the grand mythological crossover it was always trying to be. One of the biggest complaints about the theatrical cut was the humor. So many jokes felt awkwardly inserted, often interrupting emotional moments or undercutting the tension. Here, the humor is much more restrained. There are still lighter moments, but they happen naturally instead of feeling like the studio was terrified audiences might go 2 minutes without laughing. The pacing is admittedly much slower, but unlike the theatrical cut, that extra runtime is actually spent developing characters, expanding the world, and letting important moments breathe. Every member of the Justice League feels like they have a purpose. By the time the final battle arrives, it actually feels earned. But the major criticism, of course, is the movie is too long. It doesn't really need to be 4 hours. It could have been maybe 3 hours. The biggest reason for the runtime isn't the story, it's Zack Snyder's obsession with slow motion. Every dramatic entrance, every punch, every glance, every cape flutter, every heroic walk, at times it genuinely feels like the movie is happening at half speed. I understand it's part of Snyder's visual style, and sometimes it works, but after a while it just becomes annoying. Honestly, if you played the movie at normal speed whenever someone was walking dramatically toward the camera, you'd probably cut the runtime down to somewhere between 2.5 to 3 hours. Even with that criticism, though, I still think this is the best Superman-related film ever made. It's ambitious, visually stunning, treats its heroes like modern mythology, and gives every character room to grow. And it delivers on the promise the theatrical version never came close to fulfilling. It's not a perfect movie, but it's the version that should have been released in the first place. For DC fans, especially those invested in Snyder's interpretation of these characters, it's an incredibly satisfying payoff, and in my opinion, the strongest Superman film to date. It's good to share a ranking of these Superman and Supergirl movies, and I'll see you next time.